I was never one for big families, but life has a way of surprising you. My dad remarried, and with it came new dynamics, new faces enter her. My stepsister, she moved in with a quiet air about her, a mystery wrapped in soft smiles and stolen glances from the start. There was something different about the way we interacted, not uncomfortable, but not entirely normal either. I chalked it up to adjustment, but deep down I knew it was more. She had this habit of spending her mornings in the kitchen. I'd walk in, still half asleep, and there she'd be leaning against the counter, sipping her coffee, her hair a mess, but somehow still looking effortlessly put together. It wasn't like she tried to be in my way, she just was. And every time I found myself hyper-aware of her presence one morning, it all started. I was making my usual breakfast, eyes fixed on the frying pan, when she suddenly spoke. You know, she began, her voice light, teasing. "You're pretty useless in the kitchen." I glanced over, ready with a retort, but her smirk caught me off guard. It wasn't mean, it was playful, almost inviting. "Oh, and you're a master chef now." I shot back, trying to keep my tone casual, though my heartbeat betrayed me. She chuckled, stepping closer, reaching over to adjust the heat on the stove. "Someone's got to make sure you don't burn the place down." Down, her hand brushed against mine. Just for a second, maybe less, but it lingered in my mind far longer. It was the kind of touch you don't forget, the kind that stays with you, haunting the quiet moments. I told myself it was an accident, nothing more, but the way she looked at me said. Otherwise, she didn't pull away immediately, and when she did, there was a flicker in her eyes, a knowing look that sent a shiver down my spine for the next few days. It was like a game, subtle, unspoken, yet undeniably present. She'd pass by, standing a little too close, or her hand would linger on mine when passing a plate. Every interaction was loaded, charged with something neither of us dared to name at night. I'd lie awake, replaying every moment, questioning my sanity. Was I imagining it was this? Just some twisted response to our new living situation, but then in the quiet of the morning, she'd be there again, her eyes meeting mine, and all doubts would vanish. It wasn't just me, she felt it too. The tension hung in the air, thick and undeniable. We both danced around it, testing boundaries without ever acknowledging them. A glance here, a touch there. It was innocent enough on the surface, but the undercurrent was anything but. And that's how it started, a slow, deliberate pull towards something forbidden, something neither of us could resist. The kitchen had always been a neutral zone, but that morning, it felt different. She stood there leaning against the counter, idly scrolling through her phone. The sunlight filtered through the window, casting a warm glow over her face. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes lingering just a second too long, and I felt that familiar knot tighten in my stomach. Late start today. She asked, her voice casual, but her tone loaded with something more. Could say the same about you, I replied. Reaching for a mug, our hands brushed as she handed me the coffee pot, and for a brief moment, neither of us moved. I looked up and she was already watching me, her lips curving into a small, knowing smile. There was an unspoken rhythm between us, a push and pull that neither of us fully understood but couldn't ignore. She stepped closer, her shoulder grazing mine as she reached for a knife. "You're going to chop those tomatoes all wrong," she said, her voice light, but her proximity deliberate. "Show me how it's done, then." I challenged, my tone more serious than intended. She didn't back down. Instead, she leaned in, her hand wrapping around mine. Guiding the knife, her touch was firm yet gentle, her fingers warm against my skin like this. She whispered, her breath brushing against my ear. It was a simple act, a mundane task, but the intimacy of the moment was undeniable. My pulse quickened, and I could feel the heat radiating between us. I turned my head slightly, our faces now inches apart, her eyes locked onto mine. and for a moment the world outside the kitchen ceased to exist. It was just us, suspended in a delicate balance between what was right and what felt inevitable. She didn't pull away. Instead, she held my gaze, her lips parting ever so slightly. "You're getting better at this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't clear whether she was still talking about the tomatoes or something else entirely. The silence between us grew heavy, each second stretching longer than the last. I could feel the tension building a magnetic force. Pulling us closer, my mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. But all logic was drowned out by the pounding of my heart then, as if testing the waters. She let her fingers slide from mine, lingering just a little too long. The absence of her touch was palpable, leaving a void that I instinctively wanted to fill. She turned away, but not before casting a glance over her shoulder, her eyes daring me to follow. It was a subtle invitation, a challenge wrapped in a fleeting moment. My breath caught, and I realized that the line between us had grown thinner, almost non-existent. Each interaction, each shared glance, was one pushing us closer to crossing it. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that makes every small sound echo louder. I had just finished cleaning up in the kitchen when she walked in, barefoot, her steps light against the tiled floor. There was something different about her tonight. Her posture more relaxed, her expression unreadable, but captivating. She stopped a few feet away, leaning casually against the counter. Still up, she asked, her voice soft, almost teasing, "Couldn't sleep?" I replied, keeping my tone even, but my eyes betrayed me, drawn to the way her hair fell loosely around her shoulders, the subtle curve of her smile. She held my gaze, and for a moment it felt like we were the only two people in the world. She walked closer, her movements slow and deliberate, funny. She said, her voice barely above a whisper. I was thinking the same thing. Her hand reached out, brushing against mine as she slid the plate I had been holding onto the counter. It wasn't accidental this time, and we both knew it. The air between us grew heavy, charged, with an unspoken tension that neither of us could ignore. She stepped even closer, her body now just inches from mine. Her eyes searched mine, as if waiting for a sign, a word, anything to break the fragile silence. But no words came. Instead, she leaned in, her hand resting lightly on my arm. My breath hitched, and before I could think, before I could stop myself, I closed the distance between us. Her lips met mine, soft and warm, and in that instant, the world seemed to fall away. The kiss deepened, every unspoken thought and suppressed feeling pouring out in that one act. Her hands slid up to my shoulders, pulling me closer while mine found their way to her waist. Holding her, as if letting go wasn't an option, time became meaningless. And all that mattered was her, the way she fit perfectly against me, the way her breath mixed with mine. There was no hesitation, no second guessing. We had crossed a line that couldn't be undone, and yet in that moment it felt right. Her fingers tangled in my hair, her touch igniting every nerve in my body. I pulled her closer, the heat between us growing with each passing second. When we finally pulled apart, her eyes searched mine again, but this time there was no hesitation. No doubt, she smiled softly, her fingers tracing a line down my arm. "I guess we both couldn't sleep," she said, her voice barely audible. I nodded, still catching my breath, unable to form coherent words. The weight of what had just happened hung between us, but neither of us moved, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Everything we had been holding back was now out in the open, and there was no turning back. For the first time in weeks, the tension that had been building between us had finally broken. But in its place was something even more dangerous, something that neither of us was ready to face. The morning light seeped through the blinds, painting the room in muted tones. I sat at the kitchen table, the hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. My mind was a whirlwind, replaying every detail of the night before the taste of her lips, the warmth of her touch. It all felt so vivid yet surreal. She walked in quietly, her presence immediately filling the room. Her hair was slightly disheveled, and she wore the same calm expression. But there was a new weight behind her eyes. She didn't say anything at first, simply poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, her gaze fixed on the floor. The silence stretched on heavy and charged, until she finally spoke about last night. Her voice was steady, but there was an unmistakable tremor beneath the surface. She looked up, her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of uncertainty and resolve. "We can't pretend it didn't happen." I nodded, swallowing hard. I know my voice was barely above a whisper, the words catching in my throat. The gravity of our actions was settling in, and with it came a wave of guilt, fear, and something else. Something I couldn't quite name, but was just as powerful. She set her mug down and crossed the room, sitting across from me. "This changes everything," she said, her tone soft but firm. "We can't go back to the way things were." I knew she was right. There was no undoing what we'd done, no erasing the lines we'd crossed, but what now? The question hung between us, unspoken but palpable. "We need to be careful." She continued, her eyes searching mine for understanding. No one can know the weight of her words. Hit me hard, the thought of someone finding out of the fallout that would inevitably follow was almost too much to bear. But beneath the fear was a strange sense of relief, even satisfaction. We had shared something real, something undeniable, and no amount of guilt could change that. "I don't regret it," I said finally, the words surprising even me. "I can't." Her eyes softened, and for a moment the tension eased. She reached across the table, her hand finding mine, and the simple gesture spoke volumes. "Neither do I," she admitted, her voice barely audible. We sat there in silence, our hands intertwined, each lost in our own thoughts. The weight of the moment was heavy, but there was also a strange comfort in it, a shared understanding that we were in this together. Eventually, she stood, her hand lingering on mine for just a second longer. "We'll figure it out," she said, her tone more confident now. One step at a time, I watched her walk away, my mind racing with questions and doubts. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with risks and challenges. But one thing was clear, there was no turning back. We had crossed a line, and whatever came next, we would face it together. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video and subscribe my channel for more stories.